The torches flicker against painted walls, their flames bending shadows over faces carved by centuries. You stand inside a palace where gods and men blur into one. The air smells of incense and sweat, heavy with silence. A man dressed as the sun itself walks forward, his face elongated, his body awkward, yet his voice thunderous. His name is Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. Beside him stands a girl, too young to be called wife, yet named as one. She is his blood, his daughter, his bride, and as priests look away, as courtiers bow in fear, a question lingers in the thick desert air. Was this a union of divine necessity, or the most forbidden act of Egypt's golden throne? The palace walls were painted with gods, falcon-headed Horus, jackal-faced Anubis, the towering Amun-Ra. For centuries, Egypt's princes had grown up in the shadow of these eternal guardians, each boy raised to believe he was only a fragment in a grand divine order. But the boy who would one day call himself Akhenaten did not quite fit into the picture. Even as a child, he was strange to behold. His skull elongated, his body lanky and uneven, his lips too full, his eyes set deep and wide. Some whispered it was a curse, others said it was a mark of the gods. He walked through the echoing halls not as a golden prince, but as an awkward shadow among brothers and courtiers who embodied perfection. He learned early that he was different, and difference, in Egypt, was dangerous. At court, the priests of Amun stood tall and certain. Their chants filled the temples with smoke and gold, their coffers overflowing with offerings from every corner of the Nile. They did not look at the boy with reverence. To them, he was a weak branch of a mighty tree, a child unsuited to rule, destined to serve as ornament, not as pharaoh. But in the lonely hours, as desert light poured into his chambers, the boy found something the priests could not cage. He was drawn to the sun itself. Not to Horus or Amun, not to the gods that wore animal faces, but to the radiant disk that rose each morning and scorched the land into life. He stared at its rays until his eyes burned, whispering that here, perhaps, was a god that needed no image, no temple, no mouthpiece, but the sky itself. It was a dangerous thought, born in the silence of a neglected child. Yet in that light, Akhenaten saw purity. Where the priests ruled with shadows and statues, the sun burned with truth. Akhenaten was not the first choice for the throne. His elder brother, the crown prince Thutmose, carried the hopes of dynasty and priesthood alike. Thutmose had the strong jaw, the commanding stature, the aura of leadership. He was destined to be pharaoh, while Akhenaten was left in the margins, allowed to study quietly, to vanish into the painted background. But fate struck with cruel precision. Thutmose died suddenly, still young, his body carried to the tombs of princes. The court wailed, but in the shadows, Akhenaten felt the world shift. He, the boy mocked for his strange form, was now heir. The priests frowned. They knew this prince was not theirs to control. Unlike his brother, Akhenaten did not bow to tradition. He questioned. He lingered too long in the temples, staring not at Amun's gilded statues, but at the shafts of sunlight piercing through stone columns. To the high priests, his eyes seemed to look beyond their gods, dangerously so. Even in family life, he appeared detached. His father, Amenhotep III, was a giant of kingship, a man who ruled Egypt at its golden height. The young Akhenaten lived in his father's shadow, watching how Amenhotep bent the empire with a word. Yet while others saw a god-king, Akhenaten saw something fragile. An old man worshipped not for himself, but for the system of priests and temples that propped him up. In the silence of corridors, whispers followed. He is not like other princes. He speaks of the sun as if it were his companion. He dreams aloud of a god without priests, and perhaps, in that loneliness, he believed it. When he walked alone through palace gardens, He felt the warmth of Aten's rays pressing against his skin like an embrace. The river reeds shivered in the light. The desert shimmered gold. In that brilliance, he felt chosen, not by Egypt's gods, but by the blazing disk itself. By the time his father's reign waned, Akhenaten was no longer a boy of shadows. He was a man of conviction, sharpened by years of doubt and neglect. Where others sought approval from the priests, he rejected them in silence. Where others bent before tradition, he looked up to the sky. To him, the Aten was not just a sun, it was purity incarnate. No carved idol could capture its essence. No chanting priest could speak its language. Its rays stretched across rich and poor alike, touching, all without favoritism. What god of Egypt had ever done such a thing? He began to write hymns, not to Amun or Ra, but to the light itself. Words poured like prayer. The Aten rises, and life is born. The Aten sets, and death follows. All breathe through your rays. These whispers were dangerous, but intoxicating. To those who heard him, it was heresy. To Akhenaten, it was revelation. And so the neglected son, the awkward prince, began to shape an idea that would shake Egypt to its foundations. He did not yet know how far it would take him, or how much blood it would spill. But deep inside, he was convinced of one truth. He was not merely the heir to a throne. He was the child of the sun itself. The coronation of Akhenaten should have been a scene of continuity. Priests chanting, statues of Amun raised high, the new pharaoh bowing before Egypt's pantheon. But this was no ordinary king, and the ceremony itself was the first act of war. When Akhenaten placed the double crown upon his head, he did not kneel before Amun, Ra, or Osiris. He lifted his face to the sky, to the sun itself. Courtiers shifted uneasily. Priests whispered behind veils of incense. Something was wrong. The new pharaoh's first decrees were subtle at first. Slight reductions in offerings to temples, small changes in rituals. But the message grew sharper with each passing season. The mighty temples of Thebes, dripping in gold, were told they no longer held power. The name of Amun, Egypt's protector for centuries, was scratched from walls, chiseled out of monuments, erased from memory. To silence a god was unthinkable, yet Akhenaten demanded it. For the priests, it was an outrage. For the people, it was confusion. But for Akhenaten, it was liberation. He was no longer one king among many gods. He was the chosen son of one god, a god who needed no image, only light. And that light shone only through him. The Aten had no myths, no animal head, no temple filled with shadows. Its temple was the open sky, and its voice, its will, was Akhenaten himself. He was no longer merely Pharaoh, he was the living prophet of the sun. A new god demanded a new home. The old cities, Thebes, Memphis, were tainted with Amun's shadows. Akhenaten dreamed of something pure, untouched by tradition. So, in the desert, he carved out a vision. Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. It rose like a mirage upon barren sands. Wide boulevards stretched out under open sky, no roofs to block the sun's rays. Temples were designed without darkness, no sanctuaries, no hidden chambers, just vast courtyards where the sun could pour down directly upon the worshippers. Walls bloomed with reliefs of the Aten's rays reaching down, each ray ending in tiny hands offering life. And always, in the center of these scenes, stood Akhenaten and his bathed in divine light. Here, God and king were inseparable. Life in Akhenaten was suffocating, not because of shadows, but because of light. Every moment was a performance of devotion. Hymns to the Aten replaced prayers to old gods. Sculptors chiseled the king's strange body into stone again and again. Long faces, swollen bellies, delicate hands, his image fused with the divine. Children learned not of Osiris's underworld, but of a world where the sun's rays were everything. The city itself was a declaration of rebellion, a scar carved into the desert to show that Akhenaten would not compromise. But beneath the grandeur, fear grew. For if Akhenaten was the sole interpreter of the Aten, then obedience was not merely political, it was spiritual. To doubt him was to doubt the sun, and who could live without the sun? At first, some rejoiced in the vision. A god without hidden idols, a faith in open air. What could be purer? But the purity soon turned suffocating. The farmers, who once prayed to Osiris for fertile soil, no longer had his name on their lips. Sailors on the Nile, who once begged Khnum for safe waters, now faced the river in silence. The pantheon that had given Egypt its rhythm was gone, replaced with a single blazing disk. And the man who claimed to speak for it, Akhenaten's hymns filled the air. You alone shine. You alone give life. Without you, no man moves. But his people began to feel something darker. In the Aten's blinding rays, there was no space for mystery, no comfort of gods who listened in secret. There was only the eye of the sun, watching, endless, inescapable. The priests of Amun, stripped of power, seethed in silence. They watched as their temples crumbled, their names erased, their gods reduced to dust, yet they endured, waiting. For, even as Akhenaten glittered in the desert, even as Akhenaten crowned himself sole voice of divinity, whispers spread. Was he chosen by the gods, or had he crowned himself a god to hide his own fragility? The desert city shone like fire, but fire burns quickly. And while Akhenaten's light was blinding, it also cast long, growing shadows. For the god who needed no other was also a king who would allow no rival, no truth but his own. And within those walls of sunlit stone, the seeds of his downfall were already taking root. When Akhenaten raised his face to the Aten, he was not alone. By his side stood Nefertiti, the woman whose name would echo through history as one of Egypt's most beautiful and mysterious queens. In reliefs and temple walls, she appears not as a shadow behind her husband, but as his equal. Together, they lift offerings to the Aten. Together, they stand in the golden beams of the sun. For a brief, dazzling moment, she seemed more than a queen. She was almost a goddess herself. Her beauty was legendary. Artists carved her profile with delicate precision. The arched neck, the sculpted lips, the eyes that seemed to hold both fire and silence. She was painted not as a passive consort, but as a co-ruler, sometimes shown smiting enemies in the style of kings. It was as if Akhenaten had found in her the human embodiment of his god, radiant, untouchable. And yet, behind the stone reliefs, behind the staged perfection of Akhenaten, the truth was less certain. For in the later years of An's reign, Nefertiti's image fades. Her statues vanish. Her name grows quiet. Did she die? Or did the pharaoh's gaze shift elsewhere, towards something even more unsettling? Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters, and the walls of Akhenaten show them not hidden away in shadowed chambers, but always at their father's side. In scenes of family life, the girls sit on his lap, play with his face, kiss his lips. No other pharaoh had ever displayed his children with such intimacy. To the outside world, it was shocking. The daughters were painted as extensions of their parents' divinity, tiny suns orbiting the blazing star of Akhenaten. Their images were everywhere, lifting flowers, holding sistrums, dancing beneath the Aten's rays. But as Nefertiti's presence faded, these daughters stepped into a role that blurred the line between family and royalty. In inscriptions, titles begin to appear. Great royal wife, a phrase that once belonged to queens, now tied to the names of daughters. Some Egyptologists argue it was mere symbolism, a way to ensure dynastic continuity in a court where Akhenaten's theology rejected the old rules. But others whisper of something darker, that the pharaoh, in his obsession with divine purity, turned to his own blood. The courtiers dared not speak it aloud, but the scenes carved in stone raised questions. Why did his daughters hold the positions of wives? Why did they stand where queens once stood? And why, in the city of the sun, did innocence vanish into ritual and power? For Akhenaten's family was no longer private, it was political theatre. His daughters became not children, but sacred vessels, tools to embody a vision that consumed the entire kingdom. What happened to Nefertiti remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Some say she died in childbirth. Others claim she reinvented herself under a new name, co-ruling Egypt in disguise. Still others whisper that she fell victim to Akhenaten's obsession, that the Queen of Light was eclipsed by the pharaoh's fixation on his daughters. In the silence of Akhenaten's palaces, the truth is lost, but the imagery is undeniable. His household was unlike any before it. Where other pharaohs hid their family behind closed doors, he paraded his with unnatural intimacy. Where others drew clear lines between wife and daughter, He blurred them until titles themselves became indistinguishable. It is tempting to see him as a heretic, blinded by his own divinity. But perhaps he was also a man trapped by his own doctrine. In rejecting the old gods, he rejected their rules. In tearing down the system, he had to invent another. And in that invention, the only figures pure enough, close enough, divine enough, were his own flesh and blood. But in binding them to his god, he also bound them to silence. The voices of his daughters do not survive. They are carved in stone, but never speak. Their eyes stare out from walls, eternally gazing at the sun, eternally trapped in their father's shadow. And so the question lingers, were they queens of a new order, or captives of a vision they could never escape? In the light of the line between love and power blurred into something forbidden, and it was here, in these palace chambers filled with both adoration and dread, that his household became the most haunting mystery of his reign. For a king who claimed to be the voice of the sun, his legacy was fragile. Egypt's dynasties lived or died by their heirs, yet his line was precarious. Sons were few, and those that may have been born either vanished in infancy or were erased from records. What remained were daughters. 6 radiant children paraded through the city of Akhenaten, as though they were jewels in the crown of the Aten. To the people, this was unsettling. Egypt's past was built on balance. Pharaoh's bloodline secured through marriage to queens or noble women, producing princes who would continue the divine cycle. But Aten's vision had no patience for old rules. The Aten was one god, one truth, one source of life, and Akhenaten saw himself as its living vessel. Why should his heirs be mixed with other blood? Why should the divine purity of his house be diluted by mortals outside the radiance of the sun? And so the dangerous idea emerged. If daughters were all he had, daughters would become enough. Titles began to appear in the records, carved into limestone stelae. Meritaten, great royal wife. Later, Mecca, great royal wife. The words were shocking, even in a culture where royal bloodlines sometimes bent rules. Pharaohs had married sisters before, but never their own children, never so openly. Whispers grew in the palace halls. Was this piety, desperation, or madness? In Egypt, incest lived in a paradox. On the one hand, the pharaoh was divine, descended from gods who themselves married brothers and sisters. Osiris and Isis were siblings, so were Geb and Nut. For a king to echo the gods was not blasphemy, but symbolism, proof of divine blood made flesh. And yet, for ordinary Egyptians, incest was abhorrent. It was a breaking of mat, the sacred balance of order that governed life. To take one's daughter as wife was not simply unusual, it was unthinkable. But Akhenaten lived in the liminal space between human and divine. He was a man who believed his body itself was shaped by God, a prophet who tore down the pantheon and rebuilt the cosmos. In his mind, perhaps there was no taboo, only necessity. If the Aten had chosen him alone, then only those born of his body could be pure enough to stand beside him, and so the daughters ceased to be children. They became ritual objects, sacred vessels offered up to the sun. On walls of Akhenaten, they are shown with titles that belong to queens, performing ceremonies as consorts would. Some are painted with gestures of intimacy toward their father, their small hands placed where no daughter's hand should be. Was it symbolism, as some historians argue, a political gesture to show the Aten's power enclosed within one bloodline? Or was it reality, hidden in plain sight, carved into walls for eternity? The answer may never be known, but the silence of those daughters is heavy. Their voices never reach us. Their fate lies only in titles and tomb scenes that suggest both privilege and sacrifice. The union of father and daughter, whether symbolic or real, carried with it the promise of eternity. To Akhenaten, perhaps it was not an act of desire, but of ritual, a way to preserve his divine bloodline against the encroaching world. To us, it reads as cruelty, a stripping away of innocence. The daughters who bore the title of great royal wife often vanish from records soon after. Akhenaten, for instance, is shown in a tomb scene that chills the spine. Her death, possibly in childbirth, mourned by the royal family beneath the rays of the Aten. Who was the father of the child she carried? The silence of history leaves the question open, but the implication lingers. Aten's obsession with purity left his family broken, his daughters pressed into roles they could not refuse. What began as a vision of divine truth twisted into something suffocating, even monstrous. In his desperation for immortality, he sacrificed the very humanity of those closest to him, and yet, in his own eyes, it was holiness. He had become the god who needed no other, the father whose children were also his queens, the man who believed his blood alone could sustain the light of the age. But when he died, his experiment collapsed, his bloodline dissolved into dust, his city abandoned, his name cursed. The very daughters he elevated as symbols of immortality were lost to silence, their lives erased, their fates sealed by a father who claimed to love them as both children and wives. Immortality was his dream, incest was his path, but in the end, all that remained was a legacy written not in light, but in shadows. The death of Akhenaten was not marked with triumph. There was no golden age, no seamless continuation of his vision. Instead, silence descended over Akhenaten, the city he had carved from desert stone to serve as the radiant heart of the Aten. The wide avenues, the towering temples, the palaces that once echoed with hymns to the sun, all fell quiet. Without the Aten had no voice. For Akhenaten had made himself the sole bridge between God, and when that bridge crumbled, so too did the faith that had propped it up. The courtiers left first. Priests abandoned their new rituals, quietly gathering what remained of the old gods. Craftsmen and farmers, once forced to live in the heretic's capital, drifted back to Memphis and Thebes. Soon, the desert began to reclaim the stone. Sand buried the doorways. Winds howled through the empty streets, and the city of light became a city of ghosts. In the wake of An's death, the women of his household, his daughters, his consorts, his queens, disappeared into silence. Their names are fractured in the records, their images sometimes chiseled away. Akhenaten, figures once paraded as living vessels of the Aten, now drift into shadow. Some may have died young, their lives cut short in childbirth. Others were erased deliberately, their titles too scandalous to survive Egypt's return to order. Akhenaten, renamed Akhenaten, would later appear as the wife of the boy king Tutankhamun, one last echo of the heretic's bloodline woven into Egypt's history. But the rest dissolve into mystery, their fates unspoken. It is as if the kingdom itself sought to smother the memory of their strange roles, to bury not just the city, but the lives entangled in its forbidden rituals. The priests of Amun, wasted, no time reclaiming power. Temples that had been stripped of wealth now swelled with offerings once more. Sculptors were ordered to carve the old gods back into stone. Scribes scrapped name from king lists, chiseling it out as though it had never been written. To damn someone's memory was the ultimate punishment in Egypt. It was to deny them immortality, to strip their soul of the offerings and prayers that sustained the dead. Akhenaten was not merely forgotten, he was deliberately erased. Statues were smashed, inscriptions destroyed. Even the bodies of the royal family may have been moved or desecrated, their tombs left unfinished, their burial goods scattered. What had once been proclaimed the dawn of a new age was treated as a nightmare to be excised. The Aten's rays, once carved across every wall, were ground down to dust, and yet not everything could be erased. In fragments of stone buried beneath the sands, in the ruins of Akhenaten's temples, the outlines of his heresy remained. Whispers of the Sun King, who had loved only one god, and perhaps too much of his own bloodline, could never be entirely silenced. Was Akhenaten a visionary, centuries ahead of his time? Some have called him the first monotheist, a prophet who glimpsed a truth humanity would not embrace until much later. His hymns to the Aten, praising the sun as the giver of all life, sound eerily familiar to those who read the scriptures of later faiths. Was he a bridge between the old polytheistic world and the monotheisms yet to come? Or was he something darker? A man who cloaked tyranny in divinity, who stripped Egypt of its gods not for purity, but for power. The father who turned daughters into wives, who built a city in his own name, who demanded worship not just for the Aten, but for himself as its living prophet. Perhaps he was both, a prophet and a man whose obsession with truth became indistinguishable from madness. In the end, all that remains of is dust. His city, once a blazing testament to the sun, is a ruin buried in the desert. His temples crumble, his statues lie shattered. His name, erased for centuries, resurfaced only when archaeologists uncovered the ruins in the 19th century. But the questions he left behind endure. Was his experiment a failure, or was it too great for its time? Were his daughters queens or victims? Was his vision holy or horrifying? History does not answer. It only leaves us with fragments, broken faces, half-erased inscriptions, the outlines of a city swallowed by sand. And yet those fragments whisper. They whisper of a king who dared to defy gods, who believed himself chosen by the sun, who sought immortality in the blood of his own house. A king remembered not for his triumphs, but for the silence that followed him. And story does. Not end in glory, but in ruin. The children are gone. The faith is gone. Only the dust of Amana remains. And still, across millennia, his shadow lingers.